In the winter of 1243, the Lady of Goodrich Castle in Herefordshire woke to find frost on the inside of her bedchamber walls. Her breath hung visible in the air, her fingers ached, and the garderobe down the corridor promised a wind so sharp it might freeze exposed skin. This was not poverty, this was privilege. The medieval castle stands in the modern imagination as the ultimate symbol of power and romance. Stone towers rising against dramatic skies, banners snapping in the wind, great halls warmed by roaring fires where knights and ladies feasted in comfort. The reality was colder, darker, and far more uncomfortable. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, castles spread across England and France as instruments of conquest and control, but they were also places where people lived, worked, ate, slept, gave birth, fell ill, and died. And for most of those people, most of the time, life inside those stone walls was a study in endurance. The discomforts were not incidental. They were built into the architecture itself. Arrow slits designed to protect defenders guaranteed icy draughts. Massive stone walls that could withstand siege engines also held cold like a tomb. Fireplaces, when they existed at all, heated only the immediate area around them, leaving the rest of the room frigid. Windows were rare luxuries. Most openings were covered with wooden shutters or oiled linen that did little to keep out wind or rain. Even the grandest castles, home to earls and barons, offered living conditions that would strike a modern observer as closer to camping than comfort. The lady shivering at Goodrich was not suffering from neglect. She was experiencing the normal conditions of her class. The evolution of the castle began in earnest after 1066, when William of Normandy brought mortar and bailey fortifications to England as tools of occupation. These early structures were timber, a wooden tower atop an earthen mound, surrounded by a palisade and ditch. They could be built quickly, often in a matter of weeks, and they served their purpose of intimidating a conquered population. But timber rotted, burned, and could be breached. By the late 11th century, stone keeps began to replace wooden towers. The White Tower of London, completed around 1100, became the model: thick walls, small windows, and a layout that prioritized defense over every other concern. Comfort was not part of the design brief. Inside these keeps, the Great Hall served as the center of life. It was where the Lord held court, where meals were served, where disputes were settled, and where much of the household slept. The hall was often the only room with a fire, and even then many early halls relied on a central hearth with no chimney. Smoke rose toward a vent in the roof, but much of it lingered, stinging eyes and blackening walls. Chimneys and wall fireplaces became more common in the 12th century, but adoption was slow and uneven. A castle built in 1150 might still lack proper chimneys a century later. The smoke was not a failure of technology, it was simply accepted. The cold was harder to accept, but no easier to solve. Stone is an excellent insulator in theory, but medieval castles were full of gaps around doors, through shutters, up spiral staircases, and along the joins between floor and wall. Tapestries helped, as did wooden paneling where it could be afforded, but these measures merely softened the problem. In deep winter, water in basins froze overnight. Ink thickened in its wells. The garderobe, a latrine built into the thickness of the wall, with a chute dropping to a pit or moat below, became an ordeal. The stone seat was cold enough to burn exposed skin, and the draught rising up the shaft was vicious. Privacy was minimal, many garderobes were shared, and the smell, even in winter, was difficult to ignore. Sanitation was a persistent challenge. Chamber pots were emptied by servants into courtyard middens or directly into the moat. The great hall floor was strewn with rushes mixed with herbs. Lavender, meadowsweet, and tansy were common choices. The rushes absorbed spilled ale, food scraps, dog urine, and other effluvia, and they were replaced irregularly, sometimes only a few times a year. The bottom layers could become a compressed mat of organic rot. Erasmus, visiting England in the early 16th century, was appalled by the practice, noting that the rushes concealed filth that had accumulated over months. The smell, he suggested, might be contributing to the spread of disease. He was probably right. Feeding a castle household required staggering logistical effort. A modest castle might house 50 people. A large one, several hundred. Grain had to be stored in quantities sufficient to last through winter, and if necessary through siege. Meat was salted or smoked. Live animals, chickens and pigs, were kept in the courtyard. Fish ponds and dovecotes provided protein. Allah was brewed constantly, as it was safer to drink than water, and did not keep long. The kitchen, often a separate building to reduce the risk of fire spreading to the main keep, operated from before dawn until after dark. Scullions turned spits over open flames. Cooks shouted orders. Butchers prepared carcasses. And then the food had to be carried across an open courtyard, upstairs and into the hall, arriving lukewarm at best. The high table received the best cuts and the whitest bread, but even the lord ate food that was cooling, coated in smoke residue, and seasoned as much by necessity as by taste. The household itself was a machine of human labour. The constable commanded the garrison, the steward managed provisions and finances, the chamberlain oversaw the lord's private chambers and personal needs, the marshal controlled the stables and the movement of horses and carts. Beneath these officers were dozens of servants, grooms, laundresses, cooks, porters, ushers and scullions. Many slept where they worked, on benches in the hall, on straw pallets in corridors, or on the kitchen floor near the warmth of the ovens. Privacy, even for the lord and lady, was limited. Servants entered chambers at will. Guests were housed in shared spaces. The idea of a bedroom as a private retreat did not yet exist in any form recognizable today. The castles themselves required constant maintenance. Lime mortar had to be reapplied. Timber beams rotted and needed replacing. Wells had to be cleaned and tested for contamination. Rats were everywhere, as were fleas and lice. Thatched roofs, where they existed, needed regular repair. Wooden floors warped. Iron hinges rusted. The work was endless, expensive, and invisible until something failed. A collapsing roof beam could kill. A contaminated well could sicken an entire household. A fire in the kitchen could consume the whole structure in hours. Windsor Castle suffered a major fire in the 12th century. The Tower of London had multiple blazes over the centuries. Lesser fires, ones that destroyed a single wing or storehouse, were routine and often went unrecorded. And yet, people stayed. They endured the cold, the smoke, the smell, the noise, the lack of privacy, and the relentless labour, because the castle offered something more valuable than comfort. It offered security, status, and control. A castle was a statement. The lord who held it controlled the land around it, the roads that passed near it, and the people who lived within its shadow. It was a tool of governance, a centre of economy, and a symbol that could be seen for miles. To live in a castle, even in discomfort, was to live at the centre of power. That was worth cold fingers and smoky halls. But the discomforts were real, daily, and inescapable, and they shaped every aspect of life inside those stone walls. In the winter of 1202, King John spent Christmas at Corfe Castle in Dorset. The hall was hung with tapestries. A fire burned in the central hearth. The household gathered, ate, drank, and endured. Despite the flames and the press of bodies, the stone walls wept with condensation. Frost formed on interior surfaces overnight. Servants woke with aching joints and numbed fingers. The king himself, wrapped in furs and positioned nearest the fire, still complained of the cold. This was not unusual. It was normal. Medieval castles were built to withstand siege, not winter. The materials that made them defensible made them uninhabitable by modern standards. Stone was abundant, durable, and fireproof. It could support immense weight and resist battering rams, catapults, and mining. But stone has a thermal property that medieval builders understood and accepted. It holds temperature with stubborn efficiency. In summer, this was a blessing. Thick stone walls absorbed the day's heat slowly, keeping interiors cooler than the air outside. In winter, the same walls absorbed cold and radiated it inward for months. Once chilled, stone required sustained, intense heat to warm, and no medieval heating system could provide that. The cold sank into the walls in October and did not leave until April. The mortar between the stones made things worse. Lime mortar, the standard binding agent, was porous. It absorbed moisture from rain, snow, and the damp English air. That moisture froze in winter, expanding in tiny fissures and cracks. The freeze and thaw cycle weakened joints, and water seeped through gaps, creating interior damp that never fully dried. Tapestries hung against walls grew mildewed. Wooden furniture swelled and warped. Clothing stored in chests smelled of rot. The air itself felt wet, and wet cold is harder to bear than dry. The body loses heat faster when damp. Fingers stiffen. Joints ache. Illness spreads more easily. The castle was not just cold, it was cold and wet, and there was no fixing it. Windows made everything worse, and there was no way around windows. A castle needed light. Without it, interiors were black during the day, and candles were expensive and dangerous. But windows also meant openings in the walls, and openings meant draughts. In the 11th and 12th centuries, most castle windows were simple, narrow slits designed for archers, or larger openings with wooden shutters. Arrow slits were purely functional. They allowed defenders to shoot outward while minimizing exposure to incoming fire. They also allowed wind to howl through unobstructed. A single arrow slit could drop the temperature of a chamber by several degrees. Shuttered windows were only marginally better. Wooden shutters kept out rain and some wind, but they also blocked all light. The choice was cold and bright or warm and dark, and most days people chose light and suffered. Glass windows existed, but they were rare and staggeringly expensive. Glass making required fuel, skilled labor, and materials that had to be imported or extracted with difficulty. A single glazed window in the 12th century could cost as much as a war horse. Only the wealthiest lords and ecclesiastical buildings could afford them, and even then, glass was used sparingly. The windows of the Great Hall at Westminster Palace were glazed in the mid-13th century, a project that took years and drained the royal budget. Most castles made do with alternatives. Oiled linen or parchment was stretched across window frames. It let in some light and blocked some wind, but it tore easily, yellowed quickly, and was only slightly better than nothing. In the coldest months, even those coverings were taken down or rotted away, and the windows stood open to the weather. Defensive architecture compounded the problem. Murder holes, those openings in ceilings above gates and passages, were designed to pour boiling liquid or drop stones on attackers. They also let cold air flow freely between floors. Spiral staircases in towers, built narrow and clockwise to disadvantage right-handed attackers climbing upward, were wind tunnels. Portcullises, gatehouse passages, and guardrooms near exterior doors were frozen zones. The guards stationed there suffered worst of all. They stood watch in spaces designed to be defensible, not livable, and the wind cut through without mercy. The Great Hall was the warmest room in the castle, and it was still cold. The hall was the social and administrative center, the place where the household gathered to eat, conduct business, and sleep. It was also the largest interior space, often 2 stories tall, with a high timber ceiling. Heat rises, and in a hall with a 30-foot ceiling, it rose out of reach. Most halls in the 11th and 12th centuries had a central hearth, a stone platform in the middle of the floor, where a fire burned openly. Smoke rose toward the roof, where it escaped through a louver, a small opening covered by a wooden or ceramic structure designed to keep rain out while letting smoke drift through. In practice, louvers were inadequate. Smoke filled the hall, stinging eyes and coating throats. It settled into tapestries and clothing. It blackened the ceiling beams. On still days when there was no wind to draw the smoke upward, the hall became nearly unbreathable. Fireplaces set into walls began to appear in the 12th century, first in royal and high-status castles, then gradually spreading. A wall fireplace with a chimney was more efficient than a central hearth. It directed smoke upward and out, and it radiated heat from the stone surround. But chimneys were expensive to build and required constant maintenance. They had to be cleaned regularly, or creosote buildup caused chimney fires. They had to be tall enough to draw properly, which meant additional masonry and structural support. Many castles continued using central hearths well into the 14th century simply because chimneys were not worth the cost. Even with a fireplace, the heat was local. Anyone sitting within 5 feet of the fire was warm, even hot. Everyone else was cold. The fire heated the air immediately around it, but that air rose and escaped, and the cold stone walls absorbed radiant heat before it could spread. Standing with your back to the fire meant your front froze while your back roasted. Moving away from the fire meant returning to the ambient temperature of the room, which hovered just above freezing. There was no such thing as ambient warmth in a medieval castle. There was the fire, and there was cold. People tried to insulate. Tapestries were hung on walls, not for decoration alone, but to create a buffer between the stone and the air. Wealthy households commissioned elaborate woven hangings depicting biblical scenes, hunts, and heraldic symbols. These were status objects, but they were also functional. A heavy tapestry could reduce draughts slightly and absorb some moisture. It did not, however, warm the room. The cold still seeped through. Wooden paneling where it was installed worked somewhat better. Wainscoting created a small air gap between wood and stone, and wood feels warmer to the touch than stone. But paneling was expensive, required skilled carpenters, and was installed only in the most important chambers. The chapel, the Lord's chamber, and sometimes the solar, a private room for the family, might be panelled. The rest of the castle was bare stone. Beds were fortresses within fortresses. A high-status bed was enclosed by heavy curtains hung from a wooden frame. The curtains were thick wool or linen, sometimes lined with fur. Closing the curtains created a small, enclosed space that could be warmed by body heat, occasionally by a heated stone or brass pan filled with coals and placed under the covers before sleep. This worked, to a degree. The bed became a survivable microclimate. But getting out of bed meant stepping onto a freezing stone floor, often covered only by rushes or thin matting, and dressing in air cold enough to see your breath. Servants who did not have enclosed beds slept on pallets near the hearth, or in corridors, or in kitchens where residual heat from the ovens lingered. Even so, they woke cold. Children, the elderly, and the ill suffered most. Cold weakened the body. It made infections harder to fight. It caused joint pain, stiffness, and respiratory illness. Medieval medicine understood that cold and damp were dangerous, but understanding did not produce solutions. Warming stones, heated bricks wrapped in cloth, extra blankets, and proximity to the fire were the only options. People died of cold in castles, not from dramatic exposure, but from the grinding, accumulating effects of months spent in environments that sapped strength and health. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and influenza were common, and the cold made recovery slower and less likely. Even when a fire was lit and the hall filled with bodies, the cold was only ever pushed back, never defeated, and fire brought its own problems. A fire in winter was not merely desirable, it was the difference between a hall that functioned and one that did not. Without flame, candle wax would not soften enough to seal letters. Ink froze in its pot. Fingers grew too stiff to hold a quill or grip the hilt of a sword during practice. The great hall, that vaulted space where justice was dispensed and oaths were sworn, became uninhabitable after sunset, unless fire transformed it. But fire was never obedient. It warmed, yes, but it also choked, blackened, and consumed. The same hearth that made winter evenings tolerable could, with one errant spark, erase decades of accumulated wealth in a single night. The central hearth in the great hall was typically a shallow, stone-lined pit set into the floor, sometimes raised slightly on a platform of brick or tile. Logs burned directly on this surface, and the heat radiated outward in all directions. There was no chimney in most halls built before the 13th century. Smoke rose toward the roof, where it drifted through a louvre, a small ventilated opening covered by a wooden cowl to keep rain out. In theory, this arrangement worked. In practice, it depended entirely on the wind. A shift in direction could trap smoke inside, filling the hall with a grey, acrid fog that stung eyes and throats. Tapestries absorbed the smell. Clothing reeked of wood smoke for days. The highest beams of the roof turned black with soot, a permanent stain that no amount of scrubbing would remove. Visitors to the hall in the morning, long after the fire had died, could still taste smoke on their tongues. Wall fireplaces with chimneys began to appear in wealthier castles during the 12th century, first in private chambers and later in some halls. These were a significant improvement. The chimney drew smoke upward and out through a flue built into the thickness of the wall, venting above the roofline. But construction was expensive and required skilled masons who understood the geometry of draught. A poorly designed flue could backdraft, belching smoke into the room whenever the wind gusted. Even a well-built chimney required regular cleaning. Creosote and soot accumulated inside the flue, narrowing the passage and increasing the risk of a chimney fire, a roaring blaze trapped within the stone that could crack masonry or ignite wooden roof timbers. Chimney sweeps, often young boys small enough to climb the flue, scraped out the residue with brushes and scrapers. It was filthy, dangerous work. Some boys suffocated, others fell. Lighting after dark meant more fire, distributed throughout the castle in forms that were portable, smoky, and perpetually at risk of tipping over. Rushlights were the cheapest option. These were peeled rushes soaked in animal fat, usually mutton or beef tallow, then dried and held at an angle in a simple metal clip. A rushlight burned for perhaps 20 minutes before it needed replacing. The light was dim, the smell was of scorched fat, and the tendency to drip hot tallow made them unsuitable near anything flammable. Candles were better but costlier. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were standard in most households. They sputtered, smoked, and smelled of cooked meat. Beeswax candles, pale and sweet-smelling, were a luxury reserved for the chapel or the Lord's chamber. A single beeswax candle could cost as much as a day's wages for a labourer. Torches made of wood wrapped in cloth and soaked in pitch or resin gave the brightest light but also the most smoke and heat. They were used in corridors, stairwells, and courtyards jammed into iron sconces on the walls. A torch burned for an hour or two, and the resin dripped. Floors beneath sconces were often stained black. The kitchen was where fire became industrial. Roasting spits turned over open flames. Cauldrons hung from iron chains above beds of coals. Ovens built into the walls baked bread at temperatures high enough to crack poorly made bricks. The volume of fuel required was staggering. A large household might burn through several cords of wood each week just for cooking. Castles with extensive forests nearby had a steady supply. Those without had to purchase and transport timber, an expense that appeared in household accounts with depressing regularity. The kitchen was almost always built as a separate structure or housed in a dedicated wing of the castle, connected to the great hall by a covered passageway or open courtyard. This separation was deliberate. A kitchen fire that got out of control might destroy the kitchen, but it would not necessarily take the entire castle with it. The logic was sound. If cold, it also meant that food arrived at the high table lukewarm at best, and servants carrying dishes across courtyards in winter often slipped on ice. Thatched roofs were common in castles through the 12th century, especially for outbuildings, stables, and workshops. Thatch was cheap, readily available, and provided decent insulation. It was also an excellent accelerant. Dry straw ignited easily, and once burning it spread faster than men could move buckets. Stone walls might survive a thatched roof fire, but everything wooden inside, floors, beams, doors, furniture, would be lost. By the 13th century, wealthier castles increasingly used slate, tile, or lead sheeting for roofs, at least on the keep and Great Hall, but secondary structures often retained thatch well into the 14th century. Hay stored in lofts above stables posed a similar risk. A single lantern knocked over, a torch dropped by a drunken groom, and the entire supply of winter fodder could go up in flames. Horses trapped in stalls below would scream until the smoke took them. The sound carried. Windsor Castle suffered a significant fire in 1322. The blaze started in the royal apartments, though the exact cause was never conclusively recorded. Some contemporary accounts suggested a knocked-over candle. Others hinted at carelessness by a servant tending a brazier. The fire spread quickly through timber partitions and furniture, destroying several chambers before it was contained. The damage required years of repairs and substantial expenditure. The Tower of London experienced fires on multiple occasions, most notably in 1241, when a blaze in the constable's lodgings spread to adjoining structures. The proximity of the royal wardrobe, where valuable robes, furs, and documents were stored, made the incident particularly serious. Records show payments to carpenters and masons for rebuilding work that continued into 1243. Lesser fires went unrecorded in chronicles but appeared in manorial accounts and repair ledgers. A keepless motte and bailey in the Welsh marches might lose its timber palisade to a fire set deliberately during a raid or accidentally by a careless sentry. Rebuilding was expensive, but not doing so meant vulnerability. The irony was not lost on those who lived with fire daily. The same element that made life indoors possible during winter was the one most likely to destroy that shelter entirely. Precautions were routine. Buckets of water or sand were kept near hearths. Some castles maintained leather fire buckets stamped with the Lord's arms, stored on hooks in the Great Hall. Curfew laws in towns required that fires be covered or extinguished by a certain hour. And though castles were not subject to municipal regulation, the principle was understood. At night, servants banked the fire in the Great Hall, covering the coals with ash to slow combustion. In theory, this reduced risk. In practice, it also meant waking to a cold room, and the temptation to leave the fire burning hotter, longer, was strong. Fire was a servant that never slept and never forgave inattention. It cooked the meal and lit the way and kept joints from seizing in the cold. But it also waited, patient as stone, for the moment when vigilance lapsed. And when it came fast. If fire and cold were the twin spectres of castle architecture, the third was smell, and it permeated everything. If fire and cold were the twin spectres of castle architecture, the third was smell, and it permeated everything. Stone held odors the way it held moisture. Tapestries absorbed them. Clothing carried them from room to room. The air inside a medieval castle was thick with the scent of burning tallow, wet wool, sweat, smoke, and waste. It was not a smell that could be scrubbed away or ventilated out. It was structural, woven into the fabric of daily life, and anyone who lived within those walls learned not to notice it. The garderobe was the most honest architectural feature of the castle. The word itself came from the French for wardrobe, because people stored clothing near latrines in the belief that ammonia fumes would discourage moths. Whether this worked is unclear, but the practice persisted, which tells you something about the desperation of medieval housekeeping. A garderobe was typically a small chamber built into the thickness of the castle wall, accessible by a narrow passage or tucked behind a curtain in a corner of a bedchamber. Inside was a stone bench with a circular or rectangular hole cut into it. Below the hole was a chute, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes just a gap in the masonry. The chute angled downward through the wall and emerged somewhere outside above a midden pit, into the moat or straight down the exterior face of the curtain wall onto the ground far below. Sitting on a garderobe in January was an ordeal. The stone seat was cold enough to burn exposed skin. The chute acted as a chimney, funneling freezing air upward with such force that it could extinguish candles in the chamber above. Wind howled through the shaft. In some castles, garderobes were built into projecting turrets so the waste would fall clear of the walls, but this made them even more exposed to the elements. A person using a garderobe in winter could expect to be half frozen before they were finished. In summer, the smell rose back up through the chute with the warmth, bringing flies. Privacy was inconsistent. Larger castles had multiple garderobes, some reserved for the lord and lady, others shared by the household. But even private garderobes were not truly private. Servants came and went. Doors were rare. A curtain might hang across the entrance, but sound travelled freely, and stone walls echoed. The garderobe was not a place where anyone lingered. It was functional, uncomfortable, and faintly humiliating, even for those at the top of the social hierarchy. What came out of the garderobe had to go somewhere. In castles built near rivers, chutes sometimes emptied directly into the water, which solved the immediate problem and created a downstream one. In castles surrounded by moats, waste dropped into the water and stayed there, decomposing slowly and contributing to the moat's defensive reputation as a barrier no sane attacker would wade through. Moats were not just water, they were open sewers, and they smelled accordingly. Some castles had cesspits dug beneath the garderobe chutes, which were supposed to be emptied periodically by workers known as gong firmers. This job was as unpleasant as it sounds, and it paid well for exactly that reason. The waste was carted away and spread on fields as fertilizer, which was its only useful afterlife. Not everyone used the garderobe. Chamber pots were common, especially at night, when navigating dark corridors to reach a latrine was both inconvenient and dangerous. Chamber pots were ceramic or metal, sometimes plain, sometimes decorated, and they were emptied by servants each morning. The contents went into buckets, which were carried down to the midden or tossed from windows into the courtyard or moat. There was no concept of sanitary disposal as a public concern. Waste was simply moved from inside to outside, and outside was someone else's problem. Servants tasked with this labor were at the bottom of the household hierarchy, and their work was invisible by design. No one wanted to think about who emptied the pots or where the contents went. The floor of the Great Hall deserves its own consideration. Rushes were cut from wetlands and strewn across the stone or wooden floor in thick layers. They absorbed moisture, provided slight insulation, and muffled the sound of footsteps. Herbs were sometimes mixed in lavender, mint, meadowsweet, tansy. The idea was that crushing the herbs underfoot would release pleasant scents to mask the less pleasant ones rising from below. It was a losing battle. Rushes also absorbed spilled ale, food scraps, grease, blood from butchered meat brought through the hall, urine from the dogs that sprawled near the hearth, and any liquid that happened to hit the floor. Bones were tossed down for the dogs to gnaw. Diners wiped their hands on bread trenchers and dropped those too. Over days and weeks, the upper layer of rushes became matted and foul. The lower layers, undisturbed, composted slowly into a damp, reeking mat. How often rushes were changed depended on the household and the season. Some castles replaced them weekly. Others left them for months. Erasmus, the Dutch scholar, visited England in the early 16th century and was appalled by what he found beneath the rushes. A mulch of spilled beer, fish bones, vomit, dog excrement, and other matter he declined to specify. He was describing a later period, but the practice was identical in the medieval centuries. It was not neglect. It was simply how floors were managed when stone was cold. Labor was expensive, and no one had invented anything better. Bathing was not frequent, but it was not unheard of either. The idea that medieval people never bathed is a myth, but the reality was complicated. A full bath required a wooden tub, gallons of water heated over a fire, and the labor to carry that water in buckets from the kitchen or courtyard. Well, for a single person to bathe, several servants might spend an hour in preparation. The tub was often lined with cloth to prevent splinters. Herbs or flowers might be added to the water. Soap existed, made from animal fat and lye, though it was harsh and not universally used. A person might bathe a few times a year, more often in summer, and the event was significant enough to be noted. Privacy was difficult. The tub was usually set up in a bedchamber, but bedchambers were not private spaces. Servants attended in wealthier households. Bathing might be a semi-social event, with the bather receiving visitors or conducting business while in the tub. This was more common in royal courts than in lesser castles, but the principle held bathing was a logistical and social act, not a solitary one. Most daily hygiene involved washing hands and face in a basin and rinsing the mouth. Linen undergarments were changed more regularly than outer clothing, and the assumption was that clean linen absorbed sweat and dirt, keeping the body relatively clean by proxy. This was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. The castle courtyard was a barnyard. Horses were stabled along the inner walls or in separate buildings, and they produced manure in heroic quantities. A single horse could generate 20 to 50 pounds of waste per day. Multiply that by a garrison's war horses, cart horses, and palfreys, and the volume became staggering. Mucking out stables was constant work, and the manure was piled in heaps to dry before being carted to fields. Until it was carted away, it sat in the courtyard, radiating its earthy, ammoniac smell. Chickens scratched in the dirt, pigs rooted in corners, dogs wandered freely, scavenging and marking territory. The courtyard was muddy in rain, dusty in sun, and always layered with the evidence of animal life. The smell of a castle was not one smell. It was a layered, evolving thing. Smoke and tallow and wet stone, boiled meat and spilled ale, manure and straw and unwashed wool, the sharp tang of urine and the sweet rot of food waste, all held together by cold air and damp. People grew accustomed to it, the way they grew accustomed to the cold. It was simply the smell of life, of power, of a functioning household. Visitors from outside noticed. Those who lived within did not, or at least they pretended not to. The castle was a machine for living, and machines do not smell pleasant. They smell like work. The smell was one thing. The logistics of feeding the people who produced it was another, and far more complex. The question of how to feed a fortress was not philosophical. It was a daily reckoning with tonnage, distance, spoilage, and the sheer volume of fuel required to keep several hundred people alive through a winter or a siege. A large castle household in the 13th or 14th century might number 200 souls during peacetime, swelling to 500 or more when the lord was in residence with his retinue, or when war demanded a full garrison. Each of those people needed bread, ale, meat, and pottage. The logistics behind those meals was staggering, and the margin for error was thin. The castle kitchen was not a single room. It was a complex, often a separate building entirely, set apart from the Great Hall to reduce the risk of fire. At larger fortifications like the Tower of London or Windsor, the kitchen occupied its own stone structure connected to the hall by covered walkways or open courtyards. Inside, the space was dominated by enormous hearths, some wide enough to roast an entire ox, iron spits turned over the flames, operated by buoys or mechanical jacks powered by weights and gears, cauldrons large enough to hold a sheep hung from iron cranes, their contents bubbling for hours, ovens built into the walls baked bread in batches, their interiors scraped clean of ash between firings. The heat was immense, even in winter. In summer, it was nearly unbearable. The kitchen staff formed their own hierarchy. At the top was the master cook, a skilled professional who oversaw menus, managed supplies, and commanded respect. Below him were undercooks, each responsible for specific tasks: roasting, boiling, baking, sauce-making. Beneath them were the scullions, often boys or young men, who scrubbed cauldrons, plucked poultry, hauled water, and turned spits for hours until their arms ached. Butchers worked in adjoining rooms or yards, slaughtering animals and breaking down carcasses. The smell of blood, rendered fat, and burning wood mixed with the sharper notes of onions, herbs, and the occasional whiff of something spoiled. Kitchens were loud, metal clanging, orders shouted, cleavers thudding into wood, and the constant hiss and crackle of fire. The separation of kitchen from hall created a persistent problem. Food had to be carried across courtyards, upstairs, through corridors. Dishes that left the kitchen steaming arrived at the high table lukewarm at best. Sauces congealed. Roasted meat lost its crispness. In winter, the short journey through open air could chill a meal significantly. Servers moved quickly, but speed could not overcome physics. This was simply accepted. The Great Hall was too valuable, too central, and too full of people to risk filling it with cooking fires. The compromise was built into the architecture. Provisioning the kitchen required planning that stretched across seasons and miles. Grain was the foundation, wheat for the lord's table, barley for ale and servants' bread, oats for pottage and horses. These were stored in massive quantities, kept in dry rooms or stone towers, checked regularly for damp and vermin. A large household might go through several tons of grain in a month. Salted meat was the other staple: pork, beef, and mutton packed in barrels with coarse salt stored in cool cellars. The meat was hard, salty, and required soaking before cooking, but it kept. Fresh meat came from animals kept live in courtyards or nearby pastures: chickens, geese, pigs, and cattle. Dovecots provided pigeons, and fish ponds stocked with carp, pike, and tench supplied protein on fast days, which the church mandated for roughly half the year. Spoilage was the enemy. Grain could mold, meat could turn rancid despite the salt, fish went off quickly, if not eaten or preserved. Butter, stored in barrels or pots, could go rancid in warm weather. Vegetables and fruit were seasonal, eaten fresh when available, and otherwise dried, pickled, or ignored. The castle's stores were inspected constantly, and anything suspect was discarded or, more often, fed to servants or animals. Waste was inevitable, but it was also expensive, and stewards kept meticulous records of what came in and what went out. Brewing was a nearly daily task. Water from wells or rivers was often unsafe, its quality uncertain and its taste flat. Ale brewed from malted barley, hops, and water was safer and provided calories. Everyone drank it: men, women, children. The lady of the household might drink wine, imported from Gascony or the Rhine, but ale was the common currency. Brewing required space, equipment, and constant attention. Malted grain was mashed with hot water, the liquid strained, hops added, and the mixture left to ferment in wooden barrels. The ale was weak by modern standards, often consumed within days before it soured. Storing it was a challenge. Barrels leaked, temperature fluctuations ruined batches. The work never stopped. The meal itself, served in the great hall, was theatre as much as sustenance. Seating was hierarchy made visible. The lord and his family sat at the high table, elevated on a dais at one end of the hall. The most important guests sat beside them. Below, on long trestle tables arranged perpendicular to the dais, sat the household, knights, clerks, senior servants, and lesser guests, in descending order of rank. At the far end, near the screens passage that separated the hall from the service areas, sat the lowest scullions, grooms, and labourers. What you ate depended on where you sat. The high table received the best cuts of meat, white bread made from wheat, spiced dishes, and wine. The lower tables received coarser bread, pottage, and the tougher, fattier portions of the same animals. Servants ate what was left, often standing in the kitchen or corridor. Portions were not equal, and neither was service. The lord's food was presented with ceremony, dishes announced, carvers slicing meat with precision, servers kneeling as they placed plates. This was not merely courtesy, it was a demonstration of order, control, and the proper functioning of the household. Meanwhile, at the lower tables, food was passed in wooden bowls and trenchers of stale bread that doubled as plates and were sometimes eaten afterward, soaked in gravy and grease. Dogs wandered freely, gnawing on bones tossed to the floor. The noise was considerable: conversations, laughter, the scrape of knives on wood, and the occasional shout when someone spilled or argued. The symbolism extended beyond seating. The high table's food was often more elaborate, not because it tasted better, but because it required more labour, more spices, and more expertise. A roasted peacock, re-feathered for display, was a statement of wealth and access. Jellies coloured with saffron or shaped into castles were edible propaganda. Subtleties, sculptural dishes made from sugar or marzipan, were served between courses at the grandest feasts, depicting saints, battles, or heraldic beasts. These were not eaten so much as admired, then distributed to favoured guests as tokens. The meal was never just a meal, it was a carefully constructed argument about who mattered and why. Wine required its own infrastructure. It arrived in barrels from ports, transported by cart to the castle, and stored in cellars. The barrels were heavy, prone to leakage, and had to be kept cool. Wine could sour, turn to vinegar, or develop off flavours if stored poorly. The castle's butler, despite the title, was not a servant but an officer of the household, responsible for managing the wine supply, tasting it for quality, and ensuring it was served appropriately. Good wine was expensive, and its presence at the table was a marker of status as clear as any title. The meal was theatre, but the labour behind it was relentless, and it was not the only work that never stopped. The meal was theatre, but the labour behind it was relentless, and it was not the only work that never stopped. Behind every warmed chamber, every swept floor, every filled cup and laundered shirt, stood a servant. Behind every servant stood a system of ranks, duties, and oversight, so elaborate that it mirrored the feudal structure outside the walls. The castle household was not a family, it was a hierarchy, as rigid and deliberate as the stone that enclosed it, and the people who kept it running were both essential and invisible. At the top of this structure sat two men whose authority was absolute within their separate domains. The constable commanded the garrison, the soldiers, the guards on the walls, the watchmen at the gates, the armory and its contents. He answered to the Lord, but within the castle's military functions, his word was law. He decided the watch rotations, inspected the defences, oversaw the training of men-at-arms, and ensured that weapons were oiled, arrows fletched, and the portcullis mechanism greased and functional. The constable was a knight, often a younger son of another noble family, and his position carried prestige. It also carried the burden of knowing that if the castle fell, he would be among the first held accountable. The steward managed everything else: the household, the supplies, the accounts, the coordination of labour. He was the Lord's chief administrator, and his responsibilities were staggering. He oversaw the provisioning of grain, meat, ale, wine, candles, firewood, cloth, and every other material good the castle consumed. He kept the financial records, paid the wages of servants and craftsmen, negotiated with merchants and farmers, and ensured that the great hall ran smoothly when the Lord entertained guests. The steward was usually literate, often a cleric or the son of a wealthy merchant, and his authority extended into every corner of the domestic machinery. A competent steward could make a castle run like a well-tuned instrument. An incompetent one could bankrupt a lord in a season. Beneath these two pillars of authority sat a constellation of officers, each responsible for a specific domain. The chamberlain managed the lord's private chambers, his wardrobe, his personal finances, and his most valuable possessions. He controlled access to the lord's person, decided who could enter the bedchamber, supervised the valets who dressed the lord each morning, and kept the keys to the chests that held jewelry, documents, and coin. The chamberlain was a gatekeeper in the most literal sense, and his discretion was trusted absolutely. He knew which debts were overdue, which gifts had been promised, and which visitors the lord wished to avoid. The marshal oversaw the stables, the horses, the grooms, and the hounds. Horses were wealth, and their care was a serious business. The destriers and palfreys of the lord and his family required grooming, feeding, exercise, and constant attention to hoof and harness. The marshal ensured that saddles were repaired, that hay was stored dry, that farriers were available when needed, and that no horse went lame from neglect. He also managed the kennels, where hunting dogs were kept, bred, and trained. The yelping and barking that filled the courtyard each morning was his responsibility, as was the stench of straw soaked with urine and the labour of mucking out stalls every day. The usher controlled access to the great hall. He stationed himself at the doorway, admitted guests according to rank and invitation, announced arrivals, and ensured that no one entered armed unless explicitly permitted. During meals he supervised the seating arrangements, the procession of dishes from kitchen to table, and the removal of plates and leavings. He was part doorman, part master of ceremonies, and his ability to read a room and manage the egos of knights, clergy, and visiting dignitaries was essential to avoiding insult and disorder. And then there were the servants who did the actual work, the cooks who rose before dawn to light the fires, the scullions who scrubbed pots with sand and ash until their hands cracked and bled, the butchers who slaughtered pigs in the courtyard and hung carcasses in the larder, the bakers who kneaded dough in wooden troughs and tended the bread ovens until their faces were red and slick with sweat, the laundresses who hauled water from the well-boiled linens in great cauldrons, beat the fabric against stones and hung it to dry in whatever weather prevailed, the grooms who rose in the dark to feed horses, who slept near the stables so they could respond to a colic or an injury, who shoveled manure into carts and spread fresh straw with aching backs, the chambermaids who emptied chamber pots, changed rushes, swept floors and made beds, moving through the castle like ghosts expected to vanish the moment a noble entered the room. These workers had no fixed hours. They laboured when needed, which was almost always. They ate leftovers from the high table, slept in corners and attics and kitchens, and owned almost nothing. A cook, might have a spare shirt. A groom might own a knife and a wooden comb. Most servants were paid partly in kind: food, shelter, cast-off clothing, and a few pennies at year's end if the lord was feeling generous or the harvest had been good. They could be dismissed at will. They could be beaten for mistakes. If they stole, they faced the stocks, the whip, or worse. The sleeping arrangements for servants were dictated entirely by convenience and space. Few castles had designated servant quarters. Instead, people slept where they worked. Kitchen staff bedded down near the hearth, wrapped in rough wool blankets, breathing air thick with smoke and the smell of old grease. Grooms slept in the stables, curled in straw alongside the horses. Guards on night watch dozed in the gatehouse or atop the walls, wrapped in cloaks, waking every hour to call the watch and check the bailey below. Chambermaids might sleep on pallets outside the lady's chamber, ready to respond if called. Pages and squires serving the lord slept in the great hall or in the corridor outside his room, bedding down after the fire had been banked and waking before the household stirred. Privacy was not a concept that applied to servants. Their movements were monitored, their comings and goings noted. Doors were locked at night, not just to keep intruders out but to keep servants in. The keys were held by the constable, the steward, and the chamberlain, and access to certain areas, armories, treasuries, the lord's private chambers, was tightly controlled. A servant who wandered where they should not could be accused of theft, of spying, of plotting. The line between servant and prisoner was thinner than the free-born might have liked to admit. Both lived under surveillance. Both had limited freedom of movement. Both depended entirely on the will of those above them. There were moments of reprieve. Saints' days brought rest from labor, though not from the obligation to attend mass. Harvest festivals meant extra ale and a loosening of the usual order. Weddings, births, and victories brought feasts where servants might eat well for once, might dance in the courtyard, might sleep soundly, knowing the household was in a generous mood. But these were brief interruptions in a rhythm that ground on, without pause. Children born to servants often became servants themselves, inheriting their parents' positions if they were fortunate, cast out if they were not. A son might follow his father into the stables, learning the care of horses before he could read. A daughter might apprentice to the laundress or the cook, her childhood spent hauling water and stirring pots. Some servants were serfs, bound to the land and the lord who owned it, unable to leave without permission. Others were free but desperately poor, choosing service in a castle over starvation in a village. The difference mattered in law. In practice, both groups worked until their bodies gave out. The household was a machine, and every part had to function, or the whole would seize. A steward who failed to order enough grain, a marshal who let a destrier go lame, a cook who burned the lord's supper, a chamberlain who misplaced a letter from the king. These failures had consequences, and they cascaded downward. The servants bore the weight. They were shouted at, docked pay, dismissed, or worse. They learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move quietly, to make themselves useful and unremarkable. Survival in the castle household meant becoming invisible until the moment your labor was required. All this labor existed within walls that required their own constant care, or they would crumble. A castle was never finished. The moment the last stone was laid, the first crack appeared, water found its way into mortar joints, frost expanded in the gaps, and timber began its slow return to the soil. Maintenance was not an occasional project, but a permanent state of vigilance, a background hum of labor that never stopped. Without it, a fortress could become a ruin within a generation. The wall that kept enemies out also trapped moisture in, and the roof that sheltered a household became a reservoir for rot. Castles did not merely stand, they were held upright by constant, unglamorous work. Lime mortar was the glue that held stone walls together, and it was always failing. Made from limestone, burned in kilns and mixed with sand and water, mortar hardened into a bond strong enough to bear the weight of towers and curtain walls. But it was porous, and rain seeped into the joints. Freeze and thaw cycles cracked it. Wind and salt air eroded it. In coastal castles like Bamberg or Harlech, the mortar degraded faster, scoured by storms that came off the sea with relentless regularity. By the 13th century, most castles of any importance kept at least one mason on permanent retainer, sometimes a small team, whose sole responsibility was to inspect, patch, and rebuild. They moved along the walls with their trowels and buckets, scraping out old mortar and pressing in new. Scaffolding went up and came down, season after season. The work was dangerous. Falls killed men, lime burned skin, but without it, water worked its way deeper, stones shifted, and walls began to lean. The cost was not trivial. Lime had to be produced or purchased, timber cut for scaffolding, labourers paid. Account rolls from castles like Dover and Windsor show steady outlays for mortar, stone, and wages. A single tower might require weeks of work to repoint. Entire sections of wall might need dismantling and rebuilding if the damage went too deep. And this was just stone. Timber rotted faster, and there was timber everywhere, in floors, in roof beams, in the support structures for stairs and galleries, in the frames of doorways and shutters. Oak was durable but only if kept dry, and dryness was not a quality castles possessed in abundance. Rain leaked through poorly maintained roofs. Damp rose from earth floors and seeped through stone. Beams embedded in walls absorbed moisture from the masonry itself. Within a decade, a roof beam could begin to soften. Within 2, it might crack under load. Within 3, it could collapse. Carpenters worked alongside masons, replacing beams, shoring up floors, inspecting the great wooden trusses that held up the roofs of halls and chapels. The timber had to be seasoned, cut to fit, and hauled into position, often through narrow stairwells or hoisted by pulley from the courtyard below. Nails and iron fittings rusted and had to be replaced. Wood joints loosened. Floors in high traffic areas wore down and had to be resurfaced or rebuilt entirely. The Great Hall at Kenilworth Castle underwent repeated repairs to its floor in the 14th century, the result of decades of feasts, foot traffic, and the sheer weight of furniture and bodies. Timber was expensive, transport added to the cost, especially for castles far from forests. By the 15th century, some English castles were importing Baltic timber when local sources ran short. Rot was not dramatic. It was incremental, patient, and inevitable. Water was the enemy of stone and wood alike, but it was also the most essential resource a castle possessed. Wells determined whether a fortress could withstand a siege or even function in peacetime. Most castles had at least one well, often sunk deep into bedrock to reach a reliable aquifer. Some were astonishingly deep. The well at Beeston Castle in Cheshire descended over 300 feet through solid rock, a feat of medieval engineering that took years to complete. The well at Cheshire Gayard was nearly as deep. Digging them required specialized labor, miners, engineers, and workers who understood stone and water. Shafts had to be lined to prevent collapse. Buckets and ropes had to be maintained. Winches had to be kept in working order. A failing winch in a dry summer could mean disaster. Contamination was the silent threat. A well could be poisoned by a decomposing animal that fell in, by seepage from a cesspit dug too close, or by floodwater carrying filth from the courtyard. Symptoms appeared slowly: stomach cramps, fever, diarrhea spreading through the household. By the time the source was identified, dozens might be sick. Cleaning a well meant hauling out buckets of fouled water, descending into the shaft to remove debris, and praying the sickness had not spread too far. Some wells were fitted with covers to prevent animals and debris from falling in, but covers were not universal, and accidents happened. In 1216, the well at Rochester Castle was so fouled during a siege that the defenders had to ration what little clean water they could collect from rain. When the siege ended, clearing the well took weeks. Even clean wells required regular maintenance. Ropes frayed and snapped. Wooden buckets split. Iron fittings corroded. Algae grew on the walls of the shaft in summer, making the water taste foul even if it was safe. Winter brought its own problems. Ice forming at the surface, frozen ropes, and the risk of cracked stonework if water expanded in the joints. A castle without a functioning well was hostage to external supply. vulnerable in war and dependent on carts and labourers to haul barrels from rivers or springs. For this reason, well maintenance was never deferred. It was checked, cleaned, and repaired on a schedule as regular as any other essential task. Rats were everywhere, and they could not be stopped. They nested in thatched roofs, burrowed into grain stores, gnawed through wooden partitions, and bred in the dark corners of storerooms and stables. Cats were kept to hunt them, but cats could only do so much. Traps caught some, poison killed others, but for every rat removed, 2 more arrived. They thrived in the environment castles provided: warmth from kitchens, food waste in middens, straw bedding in chambers, and endless hiding places in walls and under floors. Where rats went, fleas followed. Fleas lived in rushes, in bedding, in the fur of dogs and the clothing of servants. They bit indiscriminately, and they carried disease. Lice were equally persistent, living in hair, in seams of woolen garments, in the straw of mattresses. They spread through contact, and contact was unavoidable in a household where dozens of people slept in shared spaces, ate together, and worked side by side. There was no solution, only management. Bedding was aired when weather permitted, though this was more effective against damp than pests. Rushes were changed, though not as often as they should have been. Clothing was boiled when lice became unbearable, a process that destroyed fabric as often as it destroyed vermin. Fumigation with herbs or smoke was attempted, with limited success. The pests adapted, persisted, and waited. They were part of the ecosystem of the castle, as permanent as the stone itself. Seasonal work followed the rhythm of the year. In spring, drains clogged with winter debris had to be cleared, a foul task assigned to the lowest-ranking servants. Channels that carried waste from kitchens and gardaboos were scraped clean, the muck hauled away to middens or spread on fields. Chambers were aired, shutters thrown open to let in light and wind after months of being sealed against cold. Mattresses were carried into courtyards and beaten, tapestries taken down and inspected for moth damage. Summer brought the risk of fire, and roofs were checked for dry thatch that might catch a spark. Autumn meant preparing for winter, stockpiling firewood, inspecting chimneys, repairing shutters, and ensuring that stores of grain and salted meat were secure against damp and vermin. Winter itself was a test of what had been done and what had been left undone. Leaks revealed themselves. Draughts found gaps, wells froze, and the cycle began again. The work was endless, and it was never enough. Entropy had momentum, and every castle was sliding toward it. The best-maintained fortress in England still had cracked mortar somewhere, a rotting beam waiting to fail, a well that might foul next summer. The labour that held it all together was invisible until it stopped, and then the consequences arrived quickly. A collapsed roof beam could kill, a poisoned well could empty a garrison, a flooded drain could turn a courtyard into a swamp. These were not dramatic failures but cumulative ones, the result of tasks deferred, inspections skipped, or repairs done poorly. The castle was a machine made of stone and wood and lime, and it required constant feeding. Even a well-maintained castle could not protect its inhabitants from the diseases that thrived in close quarters. A kitchen scullion at Goodrich Castle slipped on wet stone in the winter of 1267. She fell forward, her left hand plunging into a cauldron of water heating over the hearth. The burn covered her palm and 3 fingers. Within 2 days, red lines traced up her forearm. Within a week, she was feverish. She died 11 days after the accident, her hand swollen and blackened, the infection having travelled to her blood. No one recorded her name. Burns were so common in castle kitchens that her death occasioned no comment beyond the need to replace her labour. Injury was woven into the fabric of castle life, mundane and constant. Carpenters fell from scaffolding during roof repairs. Grooms were kicked by horses. Masons crushed fingers between blocks of stone. Servants cut themselves on kitchen knives, pierced their feet on scattered nails, scalded hands while pouring water or turning spits. Children tumbled down spiral staircases, their heads striking stone at intervals that left them dazed or worse. The thin line between a minor wound and a mortal one turned on factors no one understood: whether a cut was cleaned, whether bone broke through skin, whether fever arrived in the night. Infection was a shadow that followed every injury, unpredictable and often fatal. A scraped knee could suppurate and kill a stable boy. A tooth abscess could spread poison through the jaw and into the skull. Most injuries happened to those whose labor exposed them to constant risk. Blacksmiths suffered burns from forge and anvil, their hands scarred and calloused. Laundresses scalded themselves with boiling water and lye. Butchers nicked arteries and bled into the straw. Even the relatively protected could not avoid harm. A lady tore her hand on a splintered wooden chest. A lord twisted his ankle on uneven cobblestones, and the joints swelled until he could not walk for weeks. Chilblains afflicted fingers and toes each winter, the skin cracking and bleeding in the cold. The stone floors were unforgiving. A fall that might bruise on dirt could fracture on flagstone, and fractures, if the bone pierced skin or set poorly, often meant lifelong lameness or death from infection weeks later. Disease required no accident. It lived in the castle, persistent and patient, waiting in the rushes and the bedding and the corners where waste accumulated. Fleas thrived in the straw mattresses and woolen blankets, breeding in the warmth of human bodies and the fibers of cloth. They bit and fed and multiplied, and no one connected them to the fevers and aches that sometimes followed. Lice infested hair and clothing, especially in winter when layers were added and rarely removed. Rats moved freely through the underfloor spaces, the kitchens, the grain stores and the middens. They nested in thatched roofs and gnawed through wooden chests. They carried fleas of their own, and those fleas carried something no one in the 13th century had words for: Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused bubonic plague. The Black Death arrived in England in the summer of 1348, aboard ships that docked at Melcombe Regis in Dorset. It spread along trade routes, carried by flea-infested rats in grain sacks and cargo holds, and by human travellers who bore the infection in their blood. By autumn, it had reached London. By winter, it was moving through the countryside. Castles offered no protection. Their walls kept out armies, not disease. The very features that made them defensible worked against their inhabitants. Proximity was unavoidable. Servants slept in corridors and kitchens. The great hall filled nightly with dozens of people pressed together for warmth. Fleas moved easily from one body to the next, from bedding to clothing to skin. The disease announced itself with fever, headache, and swellings in the neck, armpits, or groin. These buboes were the hallmark of the plague, hard and painful, sometimes growing as large as an apple. Victims weakened rapidly. Some died within 3 days. Others lingered a week, their bodies covered in dark blotches where blood pooled beneath the skin. The pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs, killed faster and spread through breath and cough. A castle household could lose 10, 20, 30 people in as many days. At Rockingham Castle in Northamptonshire, records note the deaths of multiple servants, the chaplain, and 2 members of the constable's family in the autumn of 1348. The bodies were carried out and buried in hastily dug pits. The living burned the bedding and rushes, scrubbed the floors with vinegar, and prayed. None of it mattered. The fleas remained. The rats remained. The disease moved on when it exhausted its hosts, not because anyone stopped it. Healers existed, but their knowledge was partial and their tools inadequate. Many castles employed a resident healer, often a woman with knowledge of herbs, bone setting, and wound care passed down through oral tradition. Monasteries trained infirmarians who understood the humoral theory of medicine, the belief that health depended on balancing blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments aimed to restore balance through diet, purges, bloodletting, and herbal remedies. Feverfew for headaches, yarrow to staunch bleeding, willow bark for pain, comfrey poultices for broken bones. Some of these worked, in limited ways. Willow bark contained salicylic acid, a precursor to aspirin. Honey applied to wounds had antibacterial properties, but no one knew why they worked, and much of the pharmacopoeia was wishful thinking. Theriac, a compound of dozens of ingredients including viper flesh, was believed to cure poison and plague alike. It did neither. Childbirth was perhaps the most dangerous commonplace event in the castle. Women of all ranks faced it repeatedly, and mortality rates were staggering. 1 in 20 births ended in the mother's death, and the numbers were higher for first births and for women who labored for days without progress. Infection, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor killed frequently. Infants died at even higher rates. Perhaps 1 in 5 did not survive their first year. Midwives attended most births, skilled in positioning the mother, massaging the belly, and sometimes manually turning a breech baby. But when complications arose, there was little they could do. A baby stuck in the birth canal might be extracted with hooks if already dead, a brutal necessity to save the mother. Caesarean sections were performed only when the mother was dying or dead, a last attempt to save the child. The castle offered wealth and some access to care, but it could not overcome the microbial realities of the medieval world. Death was familiar, but so was noise, and the castle was never quiet. The great hall during a meal was a study in layered cacophony. Benches scraped against flagstones as diners shifted position. Wooden platters clattered onto trestle tables. Knives struck pewter plates with sharp metallic rings. The courtyard was louder still. This was the working heart of the castle, and work was never quiet. Blacksmiths hammered iron on anvils, each strike ringing clear and sharp across the enclosed space. Farriers shod horses, the animals stamping and snorting as hot metal met hoof. Carpenters sawed timber and drove nails. Masons chipped at stone, shaping blocks for repairs, the tap-tap of chisels a steady percussion. Carts rolled over cobbles with a grinding rumble. Their wheels were wooden, their axles ungreased or poorly greased, and the sound of their passage was a prolonged groan punctuated by the clop of hooves. Chickens clucked and squawked in their pens. Pigs grunted and squealed. Geese honked, their voices absurdly loud for their size. Dogs barked at arrivals and departures. Servants shouted to one another across distances too great for normal conversation. The traffic was constant. Grooms led horses to and from the stables. Scullions hauled water from the well, the bucket chains clanking. Cooks carried provisions from storerooms to kitchens. Laundresses crossed the yard with baskets of soiled linen. Guards descended from the walls to be relieved, their boots heavy on stone steps, their equipment jingling. The portcullis, when raised or lowered, shrieked against its chains. The great gate creaked on its hinges, a sound so deep and prolonged it seemed to come from the earth itself. Every functional element of the castle contributed its own voice, and together they formed a soundscape that was relentless and inescapable. Even at night, silence did not come. The castle simply exchanged one set of noises for another. Guards called out the watches from the wall-walks, their voices carrying through the darkness. 12 of the clock and all is well might echo across the bailey, answered by another guard at the far tower. The calls were reassurance and communication, proof that the sentries were awake and the castle secure. Gates and doors creaked as they were checked and secured. The wind, which during the day competed with human activity, became the dominant sound after dark. It moaned through arrow slits, whistled around corners, rattled shutters, and set loose objects clattering. In a storm, the wind could sound like a living thing trying to get in. Inside, the castle settled. Timber beams contracted and shifted, producing groans and cracks that could startle the nervous. Fires burned low in hearths, their logs collapsing with sudden crashes that sent sparks swirling. Rats emerged from their hiding places, and their movements were surprisingly loud in the quiet hours. They scurried through walls, scratched at wainscoting, gnawed at stored grain with audible persistence. Their squeaks and the rapid patter of their feet were ubiquitous. Hunting cats prowled, their claws clicking on stone floors. Occasionally a fight erupted, cats or rats or both, and the shrieking was brief and vicious. People slept, but not always quietly. Hundreds might be housed within the walls, and their collective presence was audible. Snoring resonated through sleeping chambers. Someone coughed, the sound harsh and prolonged. A child cried. A servant muttered in sleep. The rhythms of breathing, turning, shifting on straw mattresses or hard benches created a low ambient rustle. In the great hall, where many of the household slept on the floor or on benches, The accumulation of these small sounds formed a continuous background hum. The ill or injured might moan. The drunk might vomit. Noisily, chamber pots were used, their contents splashing audibly. Silence, when it came at all, was confined to the smallest and most isolated spaces. The chapel offered some respite, though even there the architecture conspired against true quiet. Stone floors and vaulted ceilings created a resonance that made every footstep, every cleared throat, every rustle of fabric seem magnified. Prayer itself was often communal and spoken aloud, the murmur of voices filling the space. But outside the hours of service, the chapel could approach stillness. It was one of the few places where sound seemed intentional, where the space itself encouraged a lowering of voices. The effect was relative, not absolute, but after the chaos of the hall or courtyard, even relative quiet felt profound. The Lord's chamber, if well positioned and well built, might also offer a measure of peace. Thick walls helped, as did distance from the courtyard and the hall. Tapestries and wooden panelling absorbed some sound, softening the acoustic harshness of bare stone. A closed door and a guard stationed outside could filter out the worst of the intrusions. But even here, isolation was incomplete. Footsteps in the corridor outside were audible. Voices from adjacent rooms carried through walls that were thick but not soundproof. The wind found its way through gaps around shutters. The castle was too porous, too full of openings and connections, to allow true solitude. For most inhabitants, the notion of a quiet space was foreign. Noise was simply the texture of life, as constant as cold or smoke. It marked the passage of time. The bells of the chapel, if the castle had them, rang the hours. The calls of the watch divided the night. The morning cacophony of the kitchen signalled the start of the day. The clatter of the evening meal announced its end. Sound was information. The clang of the alarm bell meant danger. The creak of the gate meant arrival or departure. The shouts of guards meant something requiring attention. To live in a castle was to exist in a perpetual state of auditory awareness, sorting signal from noise, learning which sounds mattered and which could be ignored. The paradox was that all this noise was also a kind of security. A silent castle was a dead castle, or worse, a castle taken by stealth. The presence of sound meant the machine was functioning, the household active, the defences manned. The blacksmith hammering meant weapons and tools were being maintained. The cook shouting meant the household would be fed. The guards calling meant the walls were watched. Noise was life, and life, however uncomfortable, was preferable to the alternative. Noise was a reminder that the castle was a machine, and like any machine, it could break down or be broken. A castle provisioned for war held grain in barrels stacked floor to ceiling, salted pork and beef packed in brine, dried fish hanging from rafters, sacks of beans and peas, wheels of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, and ale by the barrel. The steward who oversaw these stores kept tallies on parchment or notched sticks, counting mouths against supplies, calculating how many weeks the household could endure if the gates were barred and the enemy settled in for a long wait. It was mathematics rendered in flour and flesh, and the numbers were rarely comforting. A garrison of 50 men, a household staff of 30, a noble family of 10, and perhaps 20 additional soldiers brought in before the siege began, meant more than 100 people eating twice a day, drinking several pints of liquid each, and producing waste that had to go somewhere. The castle that had been a symbol of strength became, the moment it was surrounded, a container with finite capacity and no resupply. The decision to withstand a siege rather than flee or negotiate was not taken lightly. It meant trusting that the walls would hold, that relief would come, and that the stores would outlast the patience of the besiegers. Castellans made grim estimates based on what they had and how much they could stretch it. Bread rations shrank. Meat became a memory. Vegetables ran out first. Then the ale turned sour. Then the grain began to dwindle. Then the salted meat grew so hard and rank that even boiling it for hours barely made it chewable. Dogs and horses, if the siege went long enough, stopped being transportation or companionship and became protein. The household that had once feasted in the great hall now lined up for bowls of thin pottage, and the Lord who had presided over abundance now watched his people grow hollow-cheeked and quarrelsome. Water was the calculation that terrified every defender more than food. A castle well, if it was deep and reliable, could sustain 100 people indefinitely in theory. In practice, wells were vulnerable in ways that grain stores were not. They could run dry in summer. They could become contaminated by a dead rat, a cracked lining that let in seepage from the midden, or deliberate poisoning if the besiegers found a way to reach the water source outside the walls. Some castles drew water from springs or streams that could be cut off or fouled. Others depended on cisterns that collected rainwater, which meant that a siege beginning in late summer left defenders watching the sky and praying for storms that did not come. Thirst arrived faster than starvation. A person could survive weeks without food, but only days without water, and the body's decline was faster and more distressing. Thirst brought headaches, confusion, weakness, and finally delirium. Rationing water meant quarter pints per person per day, barely enough to wet the mouth, nothing left for washing or cooking. The decision to drink from a suspect well, knowing it might bring dysentery or worse, was a choice between slow poisoning and certain death from dehydration. Sanitation, already precarious in normal times, collapsed entirely under siege. The gardobes that had emptied into moats or external pits now filled those same moats and pits to capacity, and there was no one to clear them. The chutes became clogged. The smell, which had always been present, became overwhelming. Chamber pots overflowed because the servants who normally emptied them into the midden now had nowhere to take the contents. Courtyards that had held horses and chickens became open latrines. The great hall, packed with soldiers and servants sleeping on benches and floors, stank of unwashed bodies, stale rushes that could not be changed, and the buckets used at night because walking to the Gardo road meant navigating dark corridors in a castle where everyone was on edge. Disease followed filth as predictably as smoke followed fire. Dysentery swept through communities living in close quarters with contaminated water and no way to dispose of waste properly. Fleas and lice, already endemic, thrived. Fever broke out, and there was no physician to call, no fresh herbs to gather, no relief. The psychological toll of a siege was slower than thirst, but just as corrosive. Fear came first, sharp and clarifying. When the enemy appeared on the horizon and the gates were barred, then came the waiting. Days passed, then weeks, and the heightened alertness gave way to boredom and tension. Soldiers on the walls watched the besiegers build camps, dig trenches, and settle in. Miners might be tunneling beneath the foundations, but no one inside could see them or know when the ground might collapse. Trebuchets and mangonels lobbed stones at the walls, each impact a reminder that the defenses might not hold. The garrison, once confident, began to argue. Whose fault was it that they had not stocked more grain? Why had the Lord not negotiated when he had the chance? Were the besiegers planning to starve them out or storm the walls? Every rumor, relief is coming, the enemy is leaving, the well is poisoned, spread like fire, lifting spirits or crushing them in turn. Morale did not break all at once. It eroded in increments. The first fight over food, the first desertion attempt, the first whisper that surrender might be preferable to this. Rochester Castle in 1215 endured one of the most famous sieges in English history when King John brought his full fury against the rebel barons who held it. The defenders, perhaps 100 knights and men-at-arms, had provisioned the castle and prepared for a long resistance. John brought siege engines, miners, and an army large enough to surround the walls completely. For weeks the defenders held, repelling assaults and enduring bombardment. Then the miners reached the corner of the great tower, digging beneath the foundation and propping the tunnel with timber supports. John, in a move that became legendary, ordered his men to gather 40 of the fattest pigs they could find, drive them into the mine, and set them alight. The burning fat melted the props, the tunnel collapsed, and the corner of the tower came down in a roar of stone and dust. Even then the defenders retreated to the other half of the tower and kept fighting. They surrendered only when starvation made continued resistance impossible. The king, enraged by their defiance, wanted to hang them all. His advisors convinced him that such an act would make future sieges bloodier, because no garrison would ever surrender if they knew execution awaited them. So most of the defenders were spared, though they had lost everything: the castle, their provisions, their strength, and any illusion that walls alone could protect them. Chateau Gaillard in 1204 fell to Philip Augustus of France, after a siege that demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most formidable defences. Built by Richard the Lionheart and considered nearly impregnable, the castle sat on a cliff above the Seine, with multiple layers of walls and a garrison that believed it could hold indefinitely. Philip surrounded it, cut off resupply, and waited. Months passed. The garrison ate through its stores, then slaughtered its horses, then began to starve. Philip refused to let non-combatants, women, children, elderly servants, leave the castle, calculating correctly that their presence would drain supplies faster. The defenders, desperate to reduce the number of mouths to feed, forced these people out through the gates. Philip's men drove them back. They huddled in the no-man's land between the castle and the siege lines, dying slowly of exposure and hunger while both sides watched. Eventually, a few of Philip's men discovered that the castle's latrines emptied through a chute in the outer wall. They climbed up through the filth, emerged inside the defences, and opened a gate. The castle fell not because its walls were breached by ram or catapult, but because human waste provided a route that stone could not block. Surrender, when it came, was a negotiation conducted by men who had lost leverage but still hoped to preserve their lives and some shred of dignity. Terms varied. Sometimes defenders were allowed to leave with their weapons and horses, a gesture that acknowledged their courage. More often they left with nothing, stripped of armor and provisions, walking into exile or captivity. Sometimes the castellan was taken hostage to ensure the good behavior of his lord. Sometimes the garrison was imprisoned, ransomed, or executed depending on the politics of the moment and the mood of the victor. The castle, once surrendered, was either garrisoned by the besiegers or slighted, deliberately damaged to prevent its use by future enemies. Towers were undermined, walls pulled down, gates burned. The structure that had been home, symbol, and prison was reduced to a broken shell, useful to no one. Sieges ended, one way or another, but the discomforts of castle life did not. The towers still stand, the walls still command the landscape. A visitor to Bodiam or Carfely, or Chateau de Pierrefonds, sees strength made visible, a silhouette that says dominion without uttering a word. The medieval castle survives in the modern imagination, not as a home but as an icon. Yet for the men and women who actually inhabited these fortresses, the symbolism offered cold comfort against the wind that howled through every corridor. Castles were never built for ease. They were built to announce power, to anchor authority in stone, and to make rebellion unthinkable. A new lord arriving in a freshly conquered territory did not commission a manor house with pleasant gardens. He raised a castle, visible for miles, its silhouette a permanent reminder that resistance would meet walls too thick to breach and gates too strong to force. The Motte and Bailey castles that spread across England after 1066 were crude by later standards, but their message was immediate. William the Conqueror did not need elegance. He needed control, and he needed it quickly. Stone replaced timber not because it was warmer or more pleasant, but because it was harder to burn and impossible to dismantle without siege engines. Comfort was a luxury, security was survival. The symbolism extended beyond military function. A castle projected legitimacy. It said that the lord who held it was not merely wealthy but entitled, that his authority rested on foundations older and deeper than gold. The great hall, for all its smoke and cold, was a theatre of hierarchy. Every meal was a performance, every seating arrangement a declaration of status. The high table sat elevated. The lord and lady occupied carved chairs while others sat on benches. Portions varied by rank. The display was deliberate, and it cost dearly in labour, fuel, and patience. A household that endured smoky air and icy draughts did so because the alternative was to live outside the structures that conferred power. To abandon the castle was to abandon the claim it represented. Yet even the most stubborn lord could not ignore discomfort forever. By the 14th century, changes began to appear. Castles were still being built, but their design softened. Larger windows appeared, glazed where wealth allowed, private chambers multiplied. Fireplaces with proper flues became standard rather than aspirational. The gradual shift was not a rejection of fortification, but an acknowledgement that pure defensibility exacted too high a price. Nobles who could afford to build anew sought structures that balanced strength with livability. The fortified manor emerged as a compromise: thick walls, defensible gates, but also courtyards that caught sunlight and halls designed for warmth rather than intimidation. By the 15th century, the trend accelerated. Castles like Tattershall in Lincolnshire or Hurstmonceux in Sussex were technically fortified, but their brick construction, their broad windows, and their decorative towers signaled a different priority. These were homes first and fortresses second. The threat of siege had not vanished, but it had receded enough that lords could afford to prioritize comfort. Fireplaces outnumbered arrow slits. Private chambers came with their own latrines. Gardens replaced baileys. The very rich began to maintain multiple residences, spending winters in warmer, smaller manor houses and visiting their castles only when political theatre demanded it. The symbolism remained potent, but daily endurance was no longer required. Even as the lived reality of castle life grew less harsh, the image grew more romantic. The literature of chivalry, written largely in the 14th and 15th centuries, described castles as seats of honor and courtesy, places where knights feasted in splendor and ladies presided over courts of refined manners. The discomforts went unmentioned. Chrétien de Troyes and his successors described banquets but not the smoke, tournaments but not the latrines, noble quests but not the frozen bedchambers. The gap between literary fantasy and material truth was wide, and it has never closed. Heraldry preserved the castle as emblem, towers and battlements rendered in neat blazons, stripped of mud and rot and rendered timeless. By the 16th century, when castles had largely ceased to serve military purposes, they had already been absorbed into myth. Nostalgia settled over the ruins like moss. The persistence of the fantasy is understandable. The castle offers a vision of order, strength, and belonging that later centuries found appealing. It suggests a world where hierarchy was clear, where everyone knew their place, and where stone walls could keep chaos at bay. The truth was messier. Castles were cold. They stank. They were loud, dangerous, and exhausting to maintain. Privacy was scarce. Illness was common. Fire was a constant threat. The people who lived in them endured not because they were comfortable, but because the alternatives were worse. A lord without a fortress was a lord without leverage. A household outside the castle walls was vulnerable to raiders, rival claimants, and the endemic violence of a world where law depended on the ability to enforce it. For the servants, the calculation was simpler and grimmer. Castle life meant work, hierarchy, and the particular humiliations of proximity to power without access to its rewards. It also meant a roof, meals, and a degree of protection that village life could not guarantee. The discomforts were universal, but the compensations were unevenly distributed. A chamberlain might sleep near the fire and eat decent bread. A scullion slept in the kitchen and gnawed scraps. Both endured the same smoke, the same rats, the same stench from the garderobe. One had the authority to leave. The other did not. The paradox endured as long as castles did. They were symbols of permanence built by people who knew impermanence intimately. They projected strength while their occupants shivered and coughed and complained in letters to relatives. They were homes that felt like prisons and fortresses that could not keep out cold, disease, or time. The stones remain, stripped now of roofs and floors and the lives that once filled them. Tourists walk through ruins and imagine feasts, battles, romance. They rarely imagine the smell. They do not think about the latrines or the rats or the servants who hauled water up spiral stairs every morning. The image has outlasted the reality by centuries, and it shows no sign of fading. By the time cannon made high walls obsolete, the people who had lived in them were already moving on.